excited and happy to welcome them for today's webinar. This webinar series, or this webinar continues our webinar series for the 2018-2019 series approach, and we're happy to make you aware that we have webinars booked for several months ahead. So keep a lookout for invites coming up in November and December and beyond. We're really excited with the level of interest and participation, both from the speakers as well as the association standpoint and being able to offer this service. So make your attendance. If you have any suggestions for future topics or speakers, you can always email us at our general email address at the nysgis.net website. Without further ado, we have two great speakers today, as I mentioned earlier, Stephen Pollackov and Chris Rogers. These two individuals are well reputed in their line of work, working in public safety, emergency response, working as firefighters, and I want to turn it over to them without further delay and allow them to get into this presentation. We will have a portion of Q&A at the end of the session, towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions, you can hold off to there and shoot them in the chat box when requested. Also, if anyone wants to be able to call in using their phone, you can check the chat box. There'll be a call-in information there, as well as some other links. And with that, I turn over the presentation to Steve and Chris. Thank you, and I'll be enjoying listening to your presentation.
Thanks, Rozzy.
Thanks, Rozzy. Thank you for having us on this month's webinar. What Chris and I would like to do is we actually want to break this webinar up into two pieces. We're going to talk about a little bit on our backgrounds and what we've done with GIS and public safety. And then most recently, Chris and I had started a blog and a podcast titled Mapping Tech in Public Safety. And we want to talk a little bit about that and the focus that we're trying to get our message out to a particular audience about GIS. So I'm going to let Chris introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And first of all, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I got a really nasty head cold, and so I'm going to be pausing the talk every once in a while for this podcast. So if you see a break, I'm just hitting the audio pause so you don't hear me hack up a little bit, so if you will. So my background is I actually went to school for cartography 25 years ago, and my advisor, he suggested I pursue a career in the fire service instead, which, with long story short, I wasn't the most stellar student, but I always maintained a passion and interest in map making. So my professional background is I've been a firefighter, and I'm currently a fire lieutenant with the Kirkland Fire Department in Washington State. So I'm clear across the country from you guys. And if you go to Costco and see that Kirkland signature, it's actually named after the town that I work for. So because Costco started in Kirkland. I've been doing it for 28 years, but I've also maintained on the side doing GIS work ever since I graduated from school. And a lot of it was that I realized that there was a benefit to GIS and the fire service that was starting to burgeon, but not happening yet. And back when I first started, we were hand drawing maps, and we were hand drawing building maps, and we were color coding grids for fire demand zones, showing statistics. And I realized that that stuff I went to school for really applies more directly to the fire service than I realized. So I kind of started a GIS program with my own fire department, 22 years ago, and it's kind of took off. And as all good firefighters, we have a side job, and so I work doing consulting on the side through my fire mapping business, and I also work as an instructor at the National Fire Academy, teaching GIS to other fire department people. And it's actually been kind of exciting because one of the things, especially with teaching other firefighters, is, and I'm sure if you had experience with dealing with public safety folks in your jurisdiction or your community, they might say, "Oh, GIS, it's just they lack interest in GIS." But if you kind of put it in terms of the fact that most police and firefighters are probably the best geographers at the local level that you have, uh, they'll start putting in GIS in terms that they understand, and it starts to make sense. And I think that's a good positive way to look at how responders can add value to a GIS program. In addition to that, I work as a technical lead for the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for the use of GIS and public safety. And some of the things that we worked on, and the thing I work on especially for NAPSIG is what we call it, is map symbology guidelines. And so what it is you might be aware of, I might actually already be aware of NAPSIG in terms of the symbology guideline, but our goal is to make a local to state to national level symbology guidelines so that you have daily use map communication features across the board that's used every day instead of siloed into one particular skill set or a particular workflow. So we've developed a guideline that's pretty helpful to either create symbols that you don't have that don't exist, or we have a symbol library that you can use that's based on our guideline to create and use and consume. And some of those symbols are in PNG. All of our symbols are in PNGs, SVGs, or TrueType fonts, so you can use it in multiple mapping applications. So, and then I also work for a company called Intera as well. So, and that's about it for me. How about you, Steve?
Yes, I've been involved with GIS since my career with the FDNY. My last 12 years as a lieutenant and a captain for the New York City Fire Department. I was the GIS commanding officer for the department. I also became the incident management GIS team leader for the fire department when they formed an incident management team. I've served on numerous New York City and New York State GIS committees. I've also been a New York State GIS Association for many years. So I'm hoping that our audience today is see my name on the listservs and through the association. I'm also a member of the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS that Chris spoke about. I'm one of their GIS technical advisors. I also sit on several committees with them, as well as the Tri-State Regional Committee. I'm also on the Symbology Working Group with Chris. And since my retirement from the fire department, I'm currently working for a company named Geocom. They do GIS work for next generation 911 systems, which is kind of a new area for me. And it's been very interesting learning about the needed GIS data for next generation 911 systems. And currently we have a proposal for New York City that it seems like we're going to win, and I'm very excited to be working for New York City again and helping them with their new next generation 911 systems. So as I mentioned, we're going to break this presentation up into a few different things, but the first thing we want to talk about is how GIS is applied in the fire service. And as you've seen with our introductions, Chris and I, our predominant background is with GIS is in the fire service and emergency medical service. We recognize that GIS is so applicable in all areas of public safety, not just the fire service, but due to our background, that's where we're most comfortable in talking about. So GIS can be used in so many levels within the fire service, from pre-incident planning, which has been done for years in the fire service. My local volunteer fire department that I used to be a member of, since I joined at 18 years old, we used to take paper maps and mark out the hydrants, go to buildings around town, do walkthroughs, taking graphing paper, drawing out the footprint, the streets, marking the egresses and accesses to the buildings, marking out stuff like fire escapes, any hazardous material that may be in the building. So that's why when Chris says, we're some of the best geographers in the business, but we don't even know it. Like I said, we've been doing this for years, and unfortunately, a lot of fire departments, volunteer and paid career departments, don't even know about GIS, and that's some of the stuff that we're trying to spread the word about. That using a GIS system, you could create these plans and bring them into a database and do analysis on it, queries, looking at certain data. Now you also have the ability of sharing that information with other companies within your department or neighboring fire departments when they come into your jurisdiction on a mutual aid basis. And pre-incident planning has been going on for years within the fire service and has never really caught up in the times. Again, I've seen many fire departments, including my local fire department. Chris and I have taught at the National Fire Academy down in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I stopped in the firehouse in that town one night, and sure enough, just like my local department, they take out a 3-ring binder with plastic sheets and these hand-drawn maps stuck in the sheets, and they make great use of it, but this with the GIS technology, it could be so much better. Also, with obviously major incidents, GIS becomes a major factor. With my background in New York City, particularly with the incident management team, we had supported several major incidents, including the terror attacks on September 11th. Uh, the incident management team had handled numerous use cases in New York City with Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene. And then also when we got deployed to other parts of the country, we had gotten deployed to Binghamton, New York for a flood situation. After, I believe it was Hurricane Irene. We had gotten deployed up to Binghamton, been down to Katrina. I know in the more recent events, even though I've been retired, the team has been down to Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Marie and Hurricane Irma last year. And again, GIS is such a major component to supporting these major incidents. Also, special events in New York City, we always had GIS support. The New York City Fire Department participates in about 140 special events each year. Some of them you're very much aware of, such as the 4th of July fireworks, New Year's Eve, Thanksgiving Day Parade, the New York City Marathon. But we also support special events such as several parades throughout the year, the UN General Assembly. Anytime the president, vice president, or foreign leaders come to New York City, again, the department supports those events, and along with supporting that is GIS and mapping out these areas, mapping out street closures, stuff to that nature. Also, a common operational picture for situational awareness, having a web map, and again, as the technology had progressed into the internet and bringing with it web maps, we also started getting into mobile data collection. So teams from the incident management team, the urban search and rescue team would actually be able to go out during an event and start collecting data. We had some training sessions and participated in some drills to really get this flowing. But now we had teams actually going out and collecting data on iPads, iPhones, Android devices, sending it up to the cloud and putting it right back into our web map, our common operational picture for anybody within the department to see, and bringing that data real time right back into the operations center. We've also done some analysis with hotspots, analyzing areas of New York City that are more prone to fires. You could do analysis on firehouse locations and response times. And then obviously, as I mentioned, my main priority right now with Geocom, but again, with the FDNY, we always supported our communications bureau with dispatch. supplying GIS data to them. So I'm going to let Chris talk about a few lessons learned.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So basically, both Steve and I have done this for a couple decades now, and definitely for me, I've learned I made a lot of mistakes in my career related to GIS and the fire department, how to make a, a a good GIS system within a fire department. And this is both like at the small department level and even the big department level. So first thing is to keep it simple. And so you can go ahead and hit the next one there, Steve. Is whenever you do or whenever you create a map product or spec out a bit of technology for your local public safety agency, the understanding has to be that it must reduce work or increase the value of work you do. For example, we collect call data information and the hopes of being able to analyze it and map it and aggregate the data so we can have some blocks of information we can make decisions on, for example, station location, or if you have to prioritize like unit placement, you know, where the best place to put that stuff is. So there needs to be some value in the work in the technical work we do, but it also means nothing proprietary. And what I mean by that is, and the fire service especially, and I won't single out any particular industry, but the fire service and law enforcement have always had a relationship where we've gotten stuck into technology that was very siloed and very proprietary. So we always have to work with the application to do a particular task or goal. And so what really kind of in the future is, especially with the flattening of big data and the flattening of information, it should be if I have a bit of information, I should be able to share it cross-platform, across different services that I use, from CAD to pre-incident planning to building inspections. That should be flat enough and should be open enough that I should be able to access it from multiple access points. The other thing is be cost effective in your work. Sometimes, again, going back to is the increased value to our work important? It has to be kind of cost effective in the sense that I feel like the work, the dollars I'm putting into this, and this kind of goes for everybody. This is a no-brainer, but especially guys on the line or especially at the firehouse will complain about something that's pretty expensive, um, but they don't get any value out of it. And also use broad technology. What I mean by broad technology is that and that's the neat thing about GIS in general, is it's a broad based technology with multiple data types, multiple services that you can leverage and bring together into one view state. There are other definitely applications or things out there, and like I said, I'll remain nameless, but I think probably everybody on this webinar have some examples in their own mind of things that are, again, siloed in their particular space. And also the final thing is, we're pretty simple people in the fire service. It has to be simple enough that an 8-year-old could do it. And it's not to patronize my coworkers, but during a stressful time to get information out of something, out of a piece of technology, it does need to be the span of control needs to be such that you can be able to access that information in a very simple and fast way. So hit the next slide there, Steve.
Actually, Chris, I just want to add in there about keeping it simple enough for an 8-year-old. I like to always give the example. One of our members of our incident management team, when I conducted this training on how to use the ESRI collector app and start collecting data on a mobile device, his first comment was to me was, Steve, I'm a pencil and paper type guy. I'm not going to be able to do this. And within 15 minutes of some simple training, teaching him how to collect data on the iPad, it was already set up by myself and my staff at the GIS unit. We had him collecting data all over the fire academy, and it was that simple for him. to be able to do this. He doesn't understand the background, doesn't understand databases, doesn't understand syncing it up to the web map for everybody else to see, but he was able to go out and collect that data and add to the information we needed.
Absolutely, and actually, especially with like Web App Builder and other simplified versions of not coding but creating focused workflow applications, I think now is a good time to leverage that ability for public safety. But the big thing really is this: is that people are the most important part of GIS, and again, most of the people on the call probably are aware of that. But in the fire service, it's important to identify in your local police and fire departments, like an expert or a very interested party in that agency. And also on the flip side, if you're in the public safety side, it's very important to identify a willing accomplice within your GIS shop to help you out on your goals and tasks. And so, for example, one thing that's very important to us is communicate socially with your GIS folks and vice versa. So some good examples of that. There's one colleague of Steve and I's, Dave Blankenship, who was the GIS coordinator for the Colorado Springs Fire Department. They sent him to the fire academy so that they understood their job, and he would respond to calls as a GIS analyst for a high value or like multi-alarm calls. He'd respond as a GIS analyst to support the functions of the command system. And so there was enough vision and thought to say, hey, we're going to train this technical guy in as much as possible we can in fire service, in how to lay a hose, what's important on a fire engine, firehouse culture stuff, and the same could be said on the law enforcement side as well. And then on the flip side, there are some departments that have sent their public safety folks or line personnel to GIS classes and have actually kind of fostered and encouraged their staff on the line to be more technically involved in GIS, and really it's kind of a shift and change in public safety. We're hiring more technical folks because they're younger and they're used to this, but it's really important to kind of foster that relationship back and forth between your public safety agency and your GIS shop. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So the other thing is big data, and I threw this slide up to kind of put a fire service spin on what big data is, and so you have basically two things in fighting a fire. You have supply and you have a stream. So on the fire ground, a water supply is your source from the hydrant to the fire engine, and the hose stream or the fire stream is from the fire engine to the fire. And so on the supply side, you have with basically big data, you have a ton of sources that you could use to bring into a system, and I'm just saying system in generic terms, but we'll put it related to a GIS system. You have a ton of sources that you can bring into your fire engine, if you will, or your computer, in other terms, that you can bring in and pump it and turn levers on and direct that certain bits of data to other sources. And so, like on the fire ground, we may be, if I'm the pump operator, I might be putting that water into like small hose lines that I use inside an interior structure fire, or I might be, if I'm having a big fire where I have defensive lines that are big hose diameters, I'll be directing that water to that spot as well. So I need to have that system or source, that pump, if you will, to bring data in, churn it into a particular way, and spit it out into the appropriate locations. And get GIS terms. It could be paper, it could be digital maps, it could be web apps that are focused on a particular focused workflow, or it could be just analyzed output. Go ahead to the next slide. But the big thing is, and I kind of go back to people, is you need what I kind of call a pump operator. And so, like, on the fire ground, the most important guy on the fire ground is the pump operator, because he or she is managing the sources of water and also directing the water to the particular hose lines for suppressing a fire. Well, it's the same thing in data as well. So you basically need a pump operator who's a bit of expert on the fire service, but also an expert on where data should go. And so one of the big challenges we have in the fire service is we don't think about data enough to to help us understand where we should flow it to. And so what we'll do is we'll say, just give me all the data and I'll just figure it out. And really the important thing is you need an expert behind the scenes to push data to a particular set of outputs. Like, for example, analysis. You don't want to overwhelm the end user with a lot of information on a single map. You want to like focus it to a particular question. Or if it's an operational type map, you don't want to inundate the map with unnecessary features such as annotation for unrelated things not related to public safety. And each agency is different, but you get the idea that sometimes a map could be overwhelming. Hit the next slide there, Steve.
Actually, I just want to add to that too. We've had several conversations with colleagues over the years throughout the country. And one of the most important things that we have to be careful about with GIS and data in public safety, as Chris mentioned, we want to have enough data, but not too much data. You have to remember when fire apparatus is responding, typically they're on scene within 4 to 7 minutes. So if you overwhelm them with data and too much information, they're not going to get anything about it. We want to get what's most important about that building to the officer in charge. Why is sitting in the passenger seat of the apparatus? He has other things going on too, with radio communications, getting his gear on, getting his air pack on. They said we don't want to overwhelm them. We want to get the most vital information to them, and one of the most important pieces of data that's important is what type of hazards that they may come upon when they arrive at the scene. Other members responding maybe have a further response time, especially if they're coming in from a mutual aid, or a chief may have a further response time. That level, maybe you could give some other data to that's going to be important, because they're going to have a little bit more time to respond. So as I mentioned, we wanted to break up this webinar into two pieces. A few months back, Chris and I got into a conversation. We had both listened to podcasts, particularly some tech podcasts that we liked. I had actually come across a website about this gentleman that does a podcast, and he was saying, he was doing it for business purposes, but how it built his business so much just by doing a simple podcast. So Chris and I came up with this idea to create a podcast for public safety GIS. One of the things that we've discussed many times over the years was that Chris and I attend lots of conferences, ESRI, NAPSIG conferences. We presented at many of these conferences. One of the things that we've always seemed to realize is we feel like we're preaching to the choir. The people in the audience are GIS people involved in public safety. And while the conferences are great, I've learned valuable information at these conferences that I've taken back to the FDNY and implemented over the years. I hope that people have gained some knowledge for stuff that we had done and maybe brought it back to their departments. But one of the things that we always felt that we were missing was the non-GIS person in public safety. Maybe they never heard about GIS. Maybe they've seen maps at a major incident, but don't really know much about how it was created or what kind of use GIS can be accomplished for a major incident or any of the other type of scenarios that we identified before. So we decided to come out with this podcast and blog with our intended audience to be the non-GIS person. We obviously know we have several friends that have listened to the podcast, so we know there are GIS people, but like I said, that's our main focus to the podcast and the blog. Again, our backgrounds are fire service, and EMS, but GIS touches all areas of public safety, whether it be fire, EMS, law enforcement, search and rescue, incident management teams, wilderness fires, search and rescue. I'm sorry, I mentioned search and rescue, emergency management, and dispatch. So our goals are to keep a focus on our backgrounds and what we've accomplished and what GIS can do in public safety, but other areas such as emergency management and dispatch and search and rescue, the items that I mentioned, we have been reaching out to several people in the community, and we're looking for guests, and we're going to have guests on the show to discuss GIS within their certain areas of public safety. So far, our podcast and blog has been going over very well. We've published 4 episodes to the show. We have a 5th and 6th episode currently recorded. We've also been kind of breaking them up where, like I mentioned, either it's Chris and I discussing certain topics. We've had 2 guests on the show. We've also done a demo episode. Again, we don't want to get too technical into GIS, but we do want to explain some of the basics to, again, that non-GIS person that we're hoping is going to be listening to the podcast episodes. So we did do a demo on basic stuff like what's a point, what's a line, what's a polygon, what can it represent. We recently recorded an episode using Network Analyst and how Network Analysts can do stuff like show response times that can identify longer response times that may not meet the federal standards that are out there. And how do we translate GIS talk to public safety personnel? Again, like Chris mentioned before, we want to keep this simple at times. We don't want to get too technical. So how do we translate that technical GIS talk to somebody that's non-technical? That's kind of been our focus. As I mentioned, we're trying to do, we have done and are going to continue doing interviews with public safety GIS personnel within our field to get different aspects of it and also other areas of public safety. We want to talk about, as we mentioned, web maps and apps and how easy GIS can be for personnel. Again, they don't need to know the stuff about databases and feature classes and JavaScript, stuff like that, but we want to be able to show them, hey, we can put an iPad in your hand and start collecting data, marking up the attributes in the table, and just by clicking that submit button, you're now syncing it up to the cloud for everybody else to see. And we've also been trying to describe how, we communicate a lot in public safety via radio, via word of mouth, on the fire scene. We have to talk, we have to get orders from our superior officers on what to do next. But we also have been trying to communicate how GIS is a form of communication. And one of the things that Chris had mentioned with the symbology working group that we're both a part of is these symbols that have been created by other agencies. We've also, again, as Chris had mentioned, expanding that symbology data set. But again, there are standards out there, and when you see a certain symbol on a map, whether I be working a scenario here in the New York area, or if I went out to California and I was working with CAL FIRE at a wilderness fire, I don't have to think about it. I could look at a map, whether it be on a web browser, an iPad, or a paper map, and the symbology is the same. I don't have to think about, look at a legend, try to figure out what this stuff means. The symbols are the same right off the bat, exactly what that symbol is trying to represent. We also want to plan on interviewing some non-GIS public safety personnel that are using GIS. Again, whether it be a mobile device or some sort of web map, and talk to them and find out, what benefits are they getting out of it. I think those will be some very interesting interviews to hear feedback from the non-GIS community on how they're using this information and hopefully have them tell us how valuable it is. We also we've had discussions, we want to continue discussions, and Chris kind of mentioned it before. What about your GIS staff? Is it, civilian personnel? Are they uniformed personnel? My experience at the FDNY is we actually had a combination of uniformed staff and civilian staff, and it actually worked out very well. I was able to bring to the table, as a uniform personnel on the staff, the understanding of how the department works and, terminology, stuff to that matter, where we also had civilian personnel that were expertise in GIS, but didn't understand sometimes even just the culture of the fire service and how we operate. So we had a very good combination. And again, from the experience of Chris and I going throughout the country, talking to people and presenting at conferences, we find sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect when you speak to a civilian personnel that has never been involved with public safety. Yes, they're very good at GIS, but they don't get the part of what does my agency need from GIS. So we're trying to bridge that platform as well. We also want to try to do some episodes about some tips and tricks. Again, what makes things easier, backgrounds on stuff like that. We're also looking for suggestions. So anybody listening to this webinar, we're going to post it again. But if you go to our blog, you could put up some comments. We're always looking for ideas for episodes of the show. Anybody that's willing to be interviewed that's involved with public safety, we'd be more than happy to have you on the show. We're getting a lot of, interesting people that, we never have met before along our paths, and we're reaching out to people, and it's so nice to get to know other people in other parts of the country. Chris, do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, no, it's actually been, and Steve, like anybody normal, we don't enjoy hearing ourselves talk on public and in recording, but I found it's been a very rewarding experience talking to people outside my skill set, talking about, like, for example, next gen 911, what's important with street soundline data, and finding out that other bits of information are very helpful for my job on the line. And so it's really been a rewarding experience for both Steve and I to talk to these folks. And so we're looking forward to engaging more people on a discussion basis.
Yeah, and on our third episode, Chris had mentioned one of our good friends and colleagues, Dave Blankenship from Colorado, and he had actually had a good idea of trying to create a basic web map that we could publish and have people collect data to specifically show, how to do some basic things and how easy it can be. So one of the things we had discussed is, and we're going to make it non-public safety, but Chris and I are going to be eventually traveling some together, and also through NABSIG, we're going to be starting a second podcast specifically for some training sessions. We're going to get the opportunity to be traveling a bit and interviewing some people on site So one of the things we were thinking about doing is creating a basic web map of local microbreweries, and again, teaching non-public safety GIS people how easy it can be. Hopefully, we'll get the word out and start collecting data on microbreweries throughout the country. And then Chris and I are actually hoping to hit up some of those breweries during our
Yeah,
travel.
exactly.
So as I mentioned, we wanted to post this again. Our blog is mappingtechandpublicsafety.com. We have some information from Chris's old blog on there. Some of it needs a little bit of updating. It's definitely a work in progress. But along with each podcast that we're doing, we have a blog posting specifically about that podcast. So you could get some more information. You could also get information about the people that we're interviewing, and anything such as the demo that I mentioned that we did, the very basic demo. The podcast that we're doing is specifically audio. So we're trying to keep it very clear so somebody listening to it on audio can understand and follow along. But anything with a demo, we're also posting to YouTube. So if you go to the blog, you can actually watch the YouTube video there. I found it very interesting with podcasts. When you publish these, I've learned a lot about it to get this up and running. I never knew how much on the back end was involved, but one of the things I found very odd is the URLs are very, very long. So I actually, for this presentation, we wanted to post the URLs to the podcast. So I use Bitly, and I tried to make it even a little simpler by putting MTIPS for Mapping Tech and Public Safety dash iOS dash Google dash Spotify. There are plenty of other podcast apps out there. So if you are using another podcast app, uh, you do a basic search of Mapping Tech and Public Safety, and you'll find our podcast. Chris, do you want to add anything else to that?
No, I'm good, Steve.
I'm sorry, Chris?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, Razi, we'll turn it back over to you for any questions and answers.
Oh, U.S. National Grid question. You want to take that one, Steve?
um, Actually, in our episode that we just recorded on our podcast, it hasn't been published yet. I'm still working on some editing, but we do address the U.S. National Grid. Chris and I are big advocates for the National Grid. I've been an advocate for many years. I taught through NAVSIG some FEMA classes about the about the U.S. National Grid. I think it's very important. It is a federal standard for search and rescue. Unfortunately, there is some resistance out there. There's also a lack of knowledge about the National Grid. So as I mentioned, the episode we just recorded last week, it's not published yet. We do talk about the National Grid a bit, and we are planning on an episode and a demo episode specifically about the National Grid.
Yeah, and yeah, again, echoing Steve's sentiment a bit about the U.S. National Grid, we're big advocates, but we also realize there's some challenges with it. Namely, one being it's a new thing, quote unquote, even though it's been around. I mean, it's military grid reference system, etc. But it's we've been so used to lat long as a point location tool, and also um, the fact that the U.S. National Grid has it's there's some complexity to it. There's a lot of numbers and letters, and you have to understand the pattern of it. And it's also metric, which is that's a superior measuring system. But a lot of folks when they hear meters are going, oh, I don't do meters. So so we had some discussion on our last podcast, and we're gonna have more subject focused podcasts like on the U.S. National Grid, and how you can leverage it for like some daily use mapping, like your map books. Um, and how you can simplify it a bit so it's a little bit easier to understand. And we're also going to we know a lot of big advocates for U.S. National Grid, so we'll probably be interviewing those folks as well.
And again, anybody
Excellent.
listening to this webinar, if you want to reach out to us, if you have a strong knowledge about the National Grid and want to be on our podcast, we'd love to have you.
That's excellent. Chris and Steve, you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, sorry about that. But just to read the question that came in from Mary that Chris and Steve just answered, but just to have that on audio. The question was, are you familiar with the U.S. National Grid system for location identification? Also, what are the limitations of lat long and address geocoding for first responders? So that was the question that Chris and Steve just answered. If you have additional questions, attendees, feel free to send that via the chat and allow Chris and Steve to answer those questions. In the meanwhile, I wanted to just, say I was excited prior to this presentation and really, really great information. And I really like the analogy that you had of and now I can't remember the exact term, but the analogy of the pump guy. That's the best I can remember right now in terms of how that individual is sort of in charge of the water flow and ensuring that the most critical thing that needs to come out of that pump is actually coming out, and understanding what's required to make that continuously and to happen. So I really like that analogy and sort of bringing it into the fire department with respect to the GIS profession.
Exactly. It's a pump operator, the driver operator. Some departments call it something else, but basically it's all of you on this call are in fact, you don't realize that pump operators are data. And so when you start looking at it that way, and if you kind of convey that to the fire department, or I can't think of a good police analogy yet, so I'm working on that. But since my background is in the fire service, that's what comes up naturally to me. So
yeah, that was excellent. So we got another question coming in. What hardware do you find the most helpful in the field?
So me personally, I it's getting to a point where the hardware is becoming cheap enough and usable enough that I kind of advocate for more tablets, like in ruggedized cases and for inside apparatus stuff. But kind of the bottom line is the fire service has spent a lot of time purchasing military mil-spec tough books and inside the fire engine. But I'm kind of at a point where instead of focusing on hardware so much, I think the focus should be on data connectivity and making sure that whatever system you have is robust enough to connect to broadband data, because I think that's really going to be kind of the future in public safety, is not so much the hardware, because the hardware kind of supported local onboard data, but it should be how robust is my internet connection. So for example, FirstNet is coming out and it's supposed to have dedicated broadband connectivity in public safety. Verizon just released, oddly enough, after some controversy in California, they're releasing a separate broadband dish-like network. I'm not familiar with it, but they were advertising it. I think whatever hardware focus you have is more focused towards how well does it connect to the internet versus how rugged it is.
Plus, I think also the fact that, again, as we mentioned in the previous slide, we want to keep this simple. So having somebody with a tough book, they're not going to be using an ARC map or anything like that. We want to keep some simple stuff out there. And one of the best ways is through apps, and they're easily obtained on any sort of mobile device, whether it be a tablet. When I was with the FDNY, we had decimeter accurate Trimble GPS devices that we went out and collected data and brought it back into our enterprise databases, which was great for what we needed, but there was no way that I could put that in the hands of a firefighter or an EMS personnel and start teaching them how to use that device. It's way too complicated. With my GIS background and my staff, we, learned ArcPad and how to use these devices and bring the data back in, and that was fine. And we needed those, highly accurate devices for some data collection. But again, we want to keep it simple for the field personnel, and using apps like the Collector app or an Explorer app or any other sort of custom, app to simply collect data is the easiest way to go. One of the issues that we had with ESRI when they came out with the Collector app, and I'm just want to bring this back to what Chris was saying with connectivity, was the Collector app, you had to have connectivity. On a normal day-to-day basis, especially in New York City, that's most likely not going to be a problem. But we've seen time and time again during major incidents, we lose power or we have an excess flow of communications through cellular, and it overloads the system, and the whole system dies. We've seen this during September 11th. We've seen this during the blackout. We've seen this during the major hurricanes that have come to New York. Time and time again, this is what we're seeing. Even large events like when we had the Super Bowl in New York City. Fortunately enough, the Verizon came in. They call them cows, cellular on wheels, with these trailers that are extended antennas for cellular to boost those signals. Again, this is what we're seeing. So again, when the Collector app came out, we couldn't use it. Finally, ESRI updated the Collector app to allow an offline piece of it where you could download data, you could still collect data, and then when you got online again, you could sync that up, and that was perfect for us. And that's when we finally were able to have our team start training and using this application.
Excellent. We've got a few more questions that have come in. If we go a little bit, we'll try to stick till 1 o'clock, but if we go over time and the presenters want to continue to answer questions, allow them to go with that. Next question we have here. Do you have any suggestions, experience on getting GIS solutions into rural areas?
That's one of the topics that Chris and I have talked about on the podcast. Definitely something we want to bring up again.
And sorry, related to public safety, of course. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's a challenge, and not only in a rural area, but in my area here in Nassau County, that's even a challenge. There's a lot of departments in Nassau County, 72 fire departments to be specific. They're all volunteer. And one of the problems is volunteer fire departments, usually their main focus is not on technology. Any money that they get through donations or through their municipality is usually going to apparatus and usually going to equipment. Technology is usually furthest from their mind. So that's, again, one of the things that Chris and I want to start getting that word out there, that you can have GIS. Many of these rural areas don't even know that their counties have a GIS department that could either set up the data for them and again start putting it out on some mobile devices for them to collect even more. And they don't even know how to do this.
Yeah.
My family has a second weekend home up in Pennsylvania. My father is a volunteer fireman up there as well as our local town, and also retired from FDNY. But again, they had paper maps hanging on the wall of their firehouse. I actually digitized them, marked out their hydrants, some other information for them, and I put it up on my AGOL account, and now they can get it on their iPhones and Android phones, and it's something that they've never had before. But again, if they don't know about it, don't know where to look for it, don't know who to go to, they're never even going to use it. So that's some of the stuff again, we're trying to
Yeah.
express in our podcast and our media.
I would say like the number one tip I would offer related to that is kind of partner with the group that is doing GIS, like Steve said, in the county. And so, for example, it might be a win-win situation where if you partnered with the county GIS folks, which I'm sure if you're in a rural area are probably pretty overworked, and you kind of express some interest in helping them support their data needs in return of getting product out of them. I think that seems to be a pretty good opportunity on both sides. Again, it's building relationships between different groups to get like your end product or goal.
And also academia. There's many places like Penn State University has a huge GIS program. They actually host the Pennsylvania GIS Clearinghouse. And again, many of these universities and colleges, I'm sure, would be more than happy to help a rural area out.
Thank you, Steve and Chris. We've got a couple more questions. I think we'll go through. You guys are okay if we go a few minutes after over 1 p.m. Eastern? Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris and I could probably talk about this all day long.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I have to say, I feel like I'm listening to one of your podcast episodes. It's very informative, very soothing, very interesting throughout. So definitely check out their podcast. The URL is right on the main screen. So
That's
let's
first time
continue with this. For anyone that has to drop off a little sooner, no worries. This is being recorded, and you will be able to access this once we're complete, and you can reference that at the New York State GIS Association website, nysgis.net, and that'll be in the professional development committee page. Just for those I know that might have to dip out sooner. Next question for Steve and Chris comes from a student mentioned, is there or could there be a way that students such as myself could use the GIS system to educate ourselves in the field of emergency management or homeland security? For example, an exercise that asks students to use the GIS for pre-event planning and to use GIS during an event and post-event. If there already is something like this, where and how can we get access? So we're looking for resources, suggestions here for student and academia. So I'll turn that over to you guys.
Yeah, there's a couple of good spots. First of all, the NAPSG Foundation. It's napsgfoundation.org, which, and NAPSG's goal is to educate on public safety and provide resources for education. So if you're looking for online resources, that's one spot. Esri actually has some pretty good blog postings and webinars, and actually some document publications for learning about that stuff, and I found those very useful in the past. And then also, I drew a blank here all of a sudden. Esri actually, granted, it's canned towards or bent towards Esri products, but I find them very helpful. How about you, Steve?
Well, my first thought was going to be NAPSG. They have some excellent resources on there. They actually have, if you go to their website, as Chris mentioned, napsgfoundation.org, they have a resource tab. They have information up there about the U.S. National Grid. They have the symbology library that Chris and I mentioned that we've been working on for, I don't even know what it is, the last 10 or 12 years. You can find all that information up there. They actually will post web maps up there during certain situations, particularly hurricanes. And they're an excellent resource. And I'm sure even if you reach out to them, they could give you more information or maybe even willing to help you in some aspect.
And I just put the link to the NAPSG Foundation in the chat window. Cool.
Oh, any other questions, Roger?
I'm looking at the moderator tool. I do see a couple questions. One, it's a podcast. Is the podcast self-funded? And what resources do you need to start a GIS podcast? The answer to the first one is definitely yes. We're funding this out of, Steve and I are a bit of nerds when it comes to technology, so we're using this podcast to justify to our spouses to more gadgets. At least that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I'm doing.
Yeah, so we're this is our own deal.
Yeah, it's 100% free. There's no cost involved.
And Steve did most of the podcast. We're experimenting a lot. This is new to us as well, so we're experimenting a lot with how to do a podcast. And so right now we've settled on using Anchor.fm for our podcast tool, and then we actually recorded it in Zoom, so I'll talk face to face to a cast, record it, and then repost it out to Zoom. And if there's video, we post it YouTube.
Yeah, as I mentioned, even the same thing with the blog, the podcast is kind of a work in progress. So we got started with this. We've learned a lot about it. There's still more we're learning, but I think each time we're getting better and better at it.
Yeah. Hey, Rosie, you still on?
Yes. You guys hear me? You guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we thought we'd lost you.
Sorry,
We were going to have to take over this
sorry
whole.
No, you guys. I'm sure you guys are handling it. You guys are handling it like pros. Like you've done these a few times, so you guys definitely are working out really well. We have one other question. We have here: would a state-supported portal help volunteers?
I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of examples. Sometimes I have probably two answers, yes and no. And a lot of it is, I'll tell you, let me think of an answer to that, and I'll pass it on to Steve, because I can go, sometimes, I'll tell you this. My first thought is that a state-supported portal might be kind of bureaucratic and maybe very top-down. I think a better option is to have like sort of a common workflow that can propagate across different portals and platforms. So for example, if a local government has a good setup, they can maintain their own data in-house, but with the understanding that if the big one happens, then that could be shared with the county and state levels seamlessly versus just kind of keeping it in-house. And I think that's kind of the neat thing about web mapping and things like ArcGIS Align and Portal and other web mapping technologies. But I can also see the benefit to it as well. I tell you this, there need to be some pretty solid vision on what this portal is, and also some huge front loading and education on the typical abilities for public safety people, so they understand, they have an expectation of what they're getting versus them just going to a presentation and realizing, hey, there's a portal, here's where your data is, or here's a place where your web mapping applications are. I think that's probably some of the challenges I could see with it, but I could change my opinion on that.
I also have found, again, over the years, Chris and I, travels have brought us to a lot of places and met a lot of people, and I look at the federal government at times. They've done some very good work with GIS and what they call GeoConops and what they call the high-fill data set. But one of the things that happens, again, in my opinion, is a lot of the stuff stays way, way up top. I've always felt that, the local community and the local GIS people have much better data, much more enriched. If you start getting, moving it up to the top, the questions can start being, how often is this data updated, stuff like that. Plus, it's immense for a state or again at the federal level trying to keep up with data updates. You're always going to find much better enriched data at the local level. When we've had certain events like the Republican National Convention in New York City, and again, as I mentioned, with special events with FDNY, that was an event that we supported. And one of the first things that happened was the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency came to New York City and met with, the fire department, NYPD, New York City OEM, and that was their main goal, was to get our data because they knew we would have much better data than they had on hand. So always local and moving up, bottom up, to me is always going to be better.
Thank you, Kristen, for those responses. We have no additional questions. I want to thank you both again for making time and attending or presenting for this webinar. I want to thank our attendees for attending this webinar, and see the thank yous coming in, and well done from the attendees for an excellent presentation. I personally enjoyed it, and I think our attendees and our GS community here in New York State GIS Association has as well. With that, keep a lookout for additional webinars in the future. Please support the podcast of Stephen and Chris. I think it's excellent that we have something representative related to geospatial, GIS, mapping, that's making waves through the podcast. So definitely support that. And again, my name is Razi Kased, project manager here with Eagle View Technologies. Also the co-chair with the Professional Development Committee. Happy to continue with this webinar series. Keep a lookout for that. And with that, Stephen and Chris, anything last words before we close out?
No, thank you for your time. This is great.
Yeah, Razi, I want to thank you very much. And again, anybody in the audience that's doing any sort of public safety, please feel free to reach out to us or through Razi, through the New York State GIS Association, and we'd love to get you on an interview on the podcast.
And as mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded. We'll get this up on our website and share those links, as well as any presentation slides and information for our speakers, so that you guys can reference that as well. With that, thank you for your time, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and see you on the next webinar. Thank you, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Razi.
Thanks.